There is a word in this psalm that has been smoothed over by centuries of quotation. In Hebrew, it is masa, verb that does not mean simply to set aside. It means to spurn, to despise, to treat something as though it has no value at all. When the psalm says the builders rejected the stone, that is the word it uses. The builders did not glance at the stone and decide it was the wrong shape. They looked at it and reached for a stronger term than unusable. They mazed it, which is the same word used throughout the Hebrew scriptures for a covenant torn up and thrown at someone's feet. The stone was not just discarded, it was treated as an enemy. That is the detail that gets read past. The verse everyone quotes about Jesus was not written about Jesus at all. On the surface, it is a royal psalm of thanksgiving, written from the mouth of a king or perhaps of the whole nation, sung into the temple courtyard after a deliverance. And yet the imagery is built from a construction site. Stones were shaped to fit a wall precisely, and the ones that split or warped were flung into the rubble heap outside the city. Anyone who has ever watched a stone wall being built, or walked a field full of broken blocks at the edge of an old city, knows what a rejected stone looks like. It is the one that no hand touches. It is the one lying in the weeds, sharp-edged and humiliated. But the psalm takes that image and turns it into a biography. The one who is speaking says, "Out of my distress I called on the Lord answered me and set me free." He says the nations surrounded him like bees, thorns blazing in a fire, and he was pushed hard so that he nearly fell. Then he says, "I shall not die, but I shall live and recount the deeds of the Lord. The Lord has disciplined me severely, but he has not given me over to death." So this is not a poem about a building stone. This is a person who was nearly destroyed. The rejection he is talking about is not the kind that happens when a wall is missing a block. It is the kind that happens when people in positions of power look at a human being and decide he does not belong in the structure they are building. They do not throw him into an empty lot. They throw him out of the community, out of the covenant, out of the category of anything God could use. The Hebrew word for the stone is eben, but it is the pronoun that announces the scandal. The stone that the builders mazed has become the head of the corner. The phrase for head of the corner is rosh pinath, head. Not the base, not the footing, but the head. In ancient architecture, the pinna was the point where two walls met, the corner that locked them together. A structure could stand without a single decorative stone, but without the corner joining the load-bearing walls, the whole thing collapsed inward. So the image carries real physical weight. That which was treated as debris is now the load-bearing point of a massive building, and nothing else works until it is in place. But the psalm goes further and personalizes it. Rosh is the word for a human head, the same word used for the head of a family, the head of an army, the head over a household. So the rejected one is not merely repaired. He is promoted. He does not get stuck back in the wall where he was supposed to be in the first place. He ends up in the one position that holds the whole house up and defines its shape. No wonder the very next verse says, "This is the Lord's doing, it is marvelous in our eyes." The Hebrew particle behind this is zot, a demonstrative that points at something close enough to touch. The psalmist is not describing a doctrine. He is pointing at his own life. Thisme, here, alive, standing in front of you thighs, is the Lord's doing. And then the congregation is pulled into the wonder. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. The day is not a date on a calendar. It is the whole stretch of time through which God took the discarded and set it where it could not be missed. The one who was spurned is now standing at the center of the assembly, and the assembly is told to celebrate his existence because his existence is proof of what the Lord does with what the world throws away. Every person who has ever been passed over, dismissed, or quietly shown the door knows what the psalmist is describing without needing his vocabulary. The meeting that went on after your name was struck from the agenda. The church that never called back. The marriage that divided you from the people who once promised to love you. The professional ladder you were allowed to glimpse just before the rung was pulled out from under you. The particular ache of having been mazed, not merely ignored, but actively spurned, as if you were a flaw in the plan that had to be removed for the structure to stand. And the psalm does not respond to that ache with a simple affirmation that you are valuable anyway. It says something stranger and harder. It says that the rejection itself is the raw material. The situation you were thrown out of is not the situation God is trying to get you back into. God is setting you in a place you could not have imagined from the bottom of the heap. Not in spite of the rejection, but through it, because the rejection emptied your hands of everything you were trying to hold on to. But there is a problem with this reading, and the psalm itself creates it. The problem is the identity of the builders. The psalm never names them. They are not the distant armies that surrounded the king, the ones the psalm describes as bees swarming and thorns burning. The builders are closer. They are the ones already at work, already constructing something, convinced that they know what belongs in the structure and what does not. And here is where the word maz turns sharp. In the rest of the Hebrew scriptures, that verb is used again and again for a specific kind of contempt. It is used for the way Israel rejected the Lord. It is used for the way God sorrowfully, in judgment, spurned the people who had broken covenant with him. It is the language of holy things profaned, of sacred obligations shattered. The psalmist does not say that enemy soldiers rejected him. He says the builders did. That word would have made a First Temple audience shift where they sat, because it suggested something more menacing than military defeat. It suggested that the people doing the most religious work, the ones most confident about what God was building, were the ones who absolutely did not recognize the stone he had set before them. Imagine the scene of the psalm being sung for the first time. The congregation making its way up the temple steps, the singers lifting the antiphonal call, "Open to me the gates of righteousness," and the voices from inside answering, "This is the gate of the Lord, the righteous shall enter through it." There is dust in the air, sunlight cutting across the limestone, the sound of sandals on stone. And the one at the center of the procession is the stone itself, the one who was rejected, walking into the sanctuary not as a petitioner begging for a place, but as the evidence that the Lord keeps his word. The gates open for him because he belongs there. The people around him are not singing a metaphor. They are looking at a man who should be dead, and they are calling him the head of the corner. The entire festival is the celebration of a reversal that God performed in front of their eyes. Now go back to the builders. The anonymity of them is the unsettling part. The psalm does not pause to curse them. It does not list their crimes. They built, they rejected, and then they disappeared from the story, never named, never confronted. But the weight of the word maz hangs over them. They thought they were doing what builders do, measuring, evaluating, deciding which materials fit and which must be discarded. That is the terrifying delicacy of the psalm. The builders are not monsters. They are people with a blueprint, working in good conscience, doing what builders have always done. And when they saw the stone, they did not see its shape. They saw only that it did not match their plans. So the psalm leaves them unpunished and unmentioned, and the silence around them is worse than a verdict, because the same silence is felt every time a human being decides, with sincere certainty, that another human being has no place in the structure God is building. The builders are always religious, always busy, always convinced. And the psalm says nothing about whether they were ever forgiven. It only says that the head of the corner is not a stone they chose. We have not yet reached the moment when Jesus picks up this verse and hurls it back at the chief priests and elders who are interrogating him in the temple courtyard. We have not yet seen how Peter turns the stone into a living temple made of people who were once not a people, or how Paul sees the stone as the joint that fuses Jew and Gentile into one wall. But the psalm itself is already preparing us for that violence, because when the one who was rejected walks through the gates of righteousness, he is doing so as the head of the corner. And that means the building the builders have been raising on their own blueprints has already become the rubble heap from which the true stone is taken. The rubble heap is exactly where Jesus goes to find this verse when he needs to name what is happening in the temple courtyard. He has just finished telling the parable of the vineyard, the tenants who beat and killed the landowner's servants, then killed the sonend when he asks what the owner will do to them. The religious leaders know the answer before it leaves his mouth. He will destroy them and give the vineyard to others. Then Jesus says, "Have you never read in the scriptures the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." And he does not leave the stone sitting comfortably in the realm of metaphor. He follows it with the sentence that changes everything. "Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces its fruits." That is not a devotional reading of Psalm 118. It is a demolition notice. In the psalm, the builders are anonymous, faceless, never confronted. In the courtyard, they are standing directly in front of him, and they know the parable is about them. They are not parables. They are eyes and hands, and a carefully maintained legal system. Every stone in the temple walls around them testifies to their precision. The Greek word that Jesus uses for rejected carries a weight that the English smothers. It is epidokimasin, a compound of apo, meaning away from, and dokimazo, meaning to test, to scrutinize, to evaluate the way a metalworker evaluates ore in a furnace. In the ancient world, dokimazo was the standard term for examining coins to see if they were genuine or counterfeit. The rejected stone, then, was not discarded because the builders overlooked it. It was tested. It was held up to the light, struck against the counter, weighed in the palm, and pronounced fraudulent. The builders were not lazy or careless. They were thorough. They rendered a verdict. And when Jesus quotes the psalm into that context, he is telling the chief priests and the elders that their entire religious enterprise was a counterfeit detection operation, and they are the ones who spent their lives testing the genuine coin and stamping it as false. That detail is what makes this so much more than a comforting promise of vindication. The stone does not simply rise from the rubble because someone finally recognized its value. It rises because the rejection itself was rigorous, deliberate, and legally binding in the courts of the builders' own minds. Now here is where we return to the open silence that the psalm left behind. The builders in Psalm 118 were never named, never cursed, never given a moment of confrontation. And the silence around them suggested something terrible that they went on building after their rejection, unaware that the stone they had thrown away was about to hold up the whole building. But when Jesus quotes the verse, the silence is broken. The builders are named. They are the ones listening to him in the courtyard. And yet, listen carefully to what Jesus does and does not say about them. He does not say they were evil. He does not say they are damned. He says their kingdom is being taken away, and he says the new people will produce fruits. The builders themselves are not destroyed in their blueprint. Their reign ends not because God punishes them with violence, but because God outflanks them. The stone is raised, and the building they built for so long has become the rubble heap from which the new construction begins. They wanted to keep their building intact. God let them keep their building, but he placed the true cornerstone somewhere so far outside it that their walls no longer enclose anything. That is a word for every person who has ever been on the receiving end of a careful, thorough, well-documented rejection. You were not just dismissed, you were examined. Someone weighed you and found you lacking. Maybe it was a supervisor who reviewed your work and decided you were not the right fit. Maybe it was a church that scrutinized your questions and concluded you were not faithful enough to lead. Maybe it was a family line of thinking that tested your worth against their expectations and stamped you disqualified. The epidokimasin experience is the kind that makes you believe the builders knew what they were doing, that their verdict was accurate, that you really do not belong in any structure that matters. And the gospel does not respond by telling you the builders were fools. It tells you something far more unsettling: they were wrong. And they were wrong precisely because their testing was so thorough. They used the right standards. They just had the wrong building. Peter heard this and reached the next implication that none of the religious leaders in the courtyard could have reached. In his first letter, Peter takes the stone and turns it sideways so that the stone is no longer only Jesus. He writes, "As you come to him, a living stone rejected by human beings, but in the sight of God chosen and precious, you yourselves like living stones are being built up as a spiritual house." Peter is not changing the subject. He is completing the image that the psalm left incomplete. In Psalm 118, the stone is rejected by the builders and becomes the head of the corner. But who are the stones around the head? They are the ones who have also been rejected. Peter says that everyone who comes to the rejected stone becomes themselves a living stone. And the Greek he uses is the same family of words, apodikimos, rejected after testing. Believers are not stones that the world found valuable and then decided to keep. They are stones that the world's builders tested and threw away. The church is not a museum of approved materials. It is a heap of discarded stones that God, in a kind of divine obstinacy, has decided to use anyway. And the reason they can be built together is that they all have the same shape, the shape of the one who was rejected first and who now holds them together. This shifts the ground under every assumption about what a community of faith ought to look like. The way you recognize a true gathering of God's people is not by how polished its members are, how smoothly they fit together, how impressive the structure appears from the outside. The mark is the opposite. It is the presence of people who have been tested and disqualified by the same world that rejected Jesus, and who have found in him a head that finally makes their irregular, cracked, supposedly worthless edges fit. That is why the church is such an offense to the tidy logic of the builders. It is the only institution in the world that takes as its foundation a stone that everyone else threw away, and then takes as its membership every other stone that was thrown away after him. If you have ever been told you do not belong, the gospel does not tell you to try harder to belong. It tells you that your rejection is the exact same shape as the stone that holds up the entire house of God. Paul moves the image in a third direction, and it is the direction that makes the stone personal in a way that even Peter's image does not reach. In Ephesians, Paul is speaking to a congregation made up of Jews and Gentiles who have learned to hate one another not abstractly, but in the way that people who share a neighborhood and a table hate one another. The Jews had the covenant, the promises, the law. The Gentiles had the status, the numbers, the empire's approval. Paul says that Christ tore down the dividing wall of hostility between them, and then he describes the new building that rises out of that rubble built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole structure, being joined together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord. The Greek word for cornerstone here is akragoniaios, extreme tip of the angle, the point where two walls meet at a right angle and lock one another into place. Each wall has a different grain, a different direction, a different history. They are not flattering one another. They are pulling at right angles, and the only thing that keeps them from collapsing away from each other is the single stone at the corner that both of them rest upon. That stone is the one of those walls tested and rejected. The Jews, in Paul's reading, had examined Jesus and found him to be a false coin. But now the rejected stone is the only possible point of peace between the wall that rejected him and the wall that never knew him. The builder's verdict has been turned into the hinge of all reconciliation. If you have ever lived between two hostile groups, you know what it is to feel like there is no possible corner where they can meet. You have seen it in your own family lines, in your denomination, in the politics that divide you from people at the same table. Paul's claim is not that the two sides should try harder to respect each other or find common ground from the materials they already have. It is that both groups have already rejected the one thing that could join them, and the only hope is to come back to that same rejected stone and let him set the angle. The moment you make anything else the cornerstone, ethnicity, tradition, doctrinal purity, shared value, as the building drifts sideways and the walls split. There is only one stone that has already been tested and disqualified by every human party, and that is precisely why it can hold them all without taking a side. The whole psalm has been moving toward this, and the whole psalm has been pointing to the gates of righteousness. The rejected one walks through the gates, and the others follow. The one whom the builders cursed is singing inside the sanctuary, and everyone who was thrown out with him is singing too. The builders are still standing on their plot of ground, still testing the stones that have already been determined to be worthless by the head of the corner. And every time the church gathers, it reenacts the psalm. It is people of whom have been disqualified somewhere, most of them more times than they can count, walking through the gates that were opened for the stone that was thrown away. They are not there because they passed someone's test. They are there because the one who was tested for them did not fail.